The Erymanthian boar is part of Agatha Christie's The Labors of Hercules collection, the accomplishment of the third labor of Hercules having brought him to Switzerland. Hercule Poirot decided that being there, he might take advantage of the fact and visit certain places which were up to now unknown to him. He passed an agreeable couple of days at Chamonix, lingered a day or two at Montreux, and then went on to Aldermatt, a spot which he had heard various friends praise highly. Aldermatt, however, affected him unpleasantly. It was at the end of a valley with towering snow-peaked mountains shutting it in. He felt, unreasonably, that it was difficult to breathe. "Impossible to remain here," said Hercule Poirot to himself. It was at that moment that he caught sight of a funicular railway. Decidedly, I must mount. The funicular, he discovered, ascended first to Les Abines, then to Corrichet, and finally to Rochersnedge, 10,000 feet above sea level. Poirot did not propose mounting as high as all that. Les Abines, he thought, would be quite sufficiently his affair. But here he reckoned without that element of chance which plays so large a part in life. The funicular had started when the conductor approached Poirot and demanded his ticket. After he had inspected it and punched it with a fearsome pair of clippers, he returned it with a bow. At the same time Poirot felt a small wad of paper pressed into his hand with the ticket. The eyebrows of Hercule Poirot rose a little on his forehead. Presently, unostentatiously, without hurrying himself, he smoothed out the wad of paper. It proved to be a hurriedly scribbled note written in pencil. "Impossible," it ran, "to mistake those mustaches. I salute you, my dear colleague. If you are willing, you can be of great assistance to me. You have doubtless read of the affair Sally? The killer, Marescot, is believed to have a rendezvous with some members of his gang at Rochersnedge, of all places in the world. Of course the whole thing may be a blog, but our information is reliable. There is always someone who squeals, is there not? So keep your eyes open, my friend. Get in touch with Inspector Drouet, who is on the spot. He is a sound man, but he cannot pretend to the brilliance of Hercule Poirot. It is important, my friend, that Marescot should be taken, and taken alive. He is not a man, he is a wild boar, one of the most dangerous killers alive today. I did not risk speaking to you at Aldermatt, as I might have been observed, and you will have a freer hand if you were thought to be a mere tourist. Good hunting. Your old friend, Lamentuel." Thoughtfully, Hercule Poirot caressed his mustaches. Yes, indeed, impossible to mistake the mustaches of Hercule Poirot. Now what was all this? He had read in the papers the details of the affair Sally, the cold-blooded murder of a well-known Parisian bookmaker. The identity of the murderer was known. Marescot was a member of a well-known racecourse gang. He had been suspected of many other killings, but this time his guilt was proved up to the hilt. He had got away, out of France it was thought, and the police in every country in Europe were on the lookout for him. So Marescot was said to have a rendezvous at Rochersnedge. Hercule Poirot shook his head slowly. He was puzzled. For Rochersnedge was above the snow line, there was a hotel there, but it communicated with the world only by the funicular, standing as it did on a long narrow ledge overhanging the valley. The hotel opened in June, but there was seldom anyone there until July and August. It was a place ill supplied with entrances and exits. If a man were tracked there, he was caught in a trap. It seemed a fantastic place to choose as the rendezvous of a gang of criminals. And yet, if Lementuel said his information was reliable, then Lementuel was probably right. Hercule Poirot respected the Swiss commissaire of police. He knew him as a sound and dependable man. Some reason unknown was bringing Marescot to this meeting place far above civilization. Hercule Poirot sighed. To hunt down a ruthless killer was not his idea of a pleasant holiday. Brain work from an armchair, he reflected, was more in his line. Not to ensnare a wild boar upon a mountainside. A wild boar, that was the term Lementuel had used. It was certainly an odd coincidence. He murmured to himself, the fourth labor of Hercules, the Erymanthian boar? Quietly. Without ostentation, he took careful stock of his fellow passengers. On the seat opposite him was an American tourist. The pattern of his clothes, of his overcoat, the grip he carried, down to his hopeful friendliness and his naive absorption in the scenery, even the guidebook in his hand, all gave him away and proclaimed him a small-town American seeing Europe for the first time. In another minute or two, Poirot judged, he would break into speech. His wistful dog-like expression could not be mistaken. On the other side of the carriage a tall, rather distinguished-looking man with grayish hair and a big curved nose was reading a German book. He had the strong mobile fingers of a musician or a surgeon. Farther away still were three men all of the same type. Men with bowed legs and an indescribable suggestion of horsiness about them. They were playing cards. Presently, perhaps, they would suggest a stranger cutting in on the game. At first, the stranger would win. Afterwards, the luck would run the other way. Nothing very unusual about the three men. The only thing that was unusual was the place where they were. One might have seen them in any train on the way to a race meeting, or on an unimportant liner. But in an almost empty funicular, no. There was one other occupant of the carriage, a woman. She was tall and dark. It was a beautiful face, a face that might have expressed a whole gamut of emotion, but which instead was frozen into a strange inexpressiveness. She looked at no one, staring out at the valley below. Presently, as Poirot had expected, the American began to talk. His name, he said, was Schwartz. It was his first visit to Europe. The scenery, he said, was just grand. He'd been very deeply impressed by the castle of Chillon. He didn't think much of Paris as a city, overrated. He'd been to the Folies Bergers and the Louvre and Notre Dame, and he'd noticed that none of these restaurants and cafes could play hot jazz properly. The Champs-Élysées, he thought, was pretty good, and he liked the fountains especially when they were floodlit. Nobody got out at Les Avines or at Corrichet. It was clear that everyone in the funicular was going up to Rocher's Nedge. Mr. Schwartz explained his own reasons. He had always wished, he said, to be high up among snow mountains. 10,000 feet was pretty good. He'd heard that you couldn't boil an egg properly when you were as high up as that. In the innocent friendliness of his heart, Mr. Schwartz endeavored to draw the tall, gray-haired man on the other side of the carriage into the conversation, but the latter merely stared at him coldly over his pince-nez and returned to the perusal of his book. Mr. Schwartz then offered to exchange places with the dark lady. She would get a better view, he explained. It was doubtful whether she understood English. Anyway, she merely shook her head and shrank closer into the fur collar of her coat. Mr. Schwartz murmured to Poirot, "Seems kind of wrong to see a woman traveling about alone with no one to see to things for her. A woman needs a lot of looking after when she's traveling." Remembering certain American women he had met on the continent, Hercule Poirot agreed. Mr. Schwartz sighed. He found the world unfriendly. "And surely," his brown eyes said expressively, "there's no harm in a little friendliness all round?" To be received by a hotel manager correctly garbed in frock coat and patent leather shoes seemed somehow ludicrous in this out-of-the-world, or rather above-the-world, spot. The manager was a big handsome man, with an important manner. He was very apologetic. So early in the season. The hot water system was out of order. Things were hardly in running order. Naturally, he would do everything he could. Not a full staff yet. He was quite confused by the unexpected number of visitors. It all came rolling out with professional urbanity, and yet it seemed to Poirot that behind the urbane facade he caught a glimpse of some poignant anxiety. This man, for all his easy manner, was not at ease. He was worried about something. Lunch was served in a long room overlooking the valley far below. The solitary waiter, addressed as Gustave, was skillful and adroit. He darted here and there, advising on the menu, whipping out his wine list. The three horsey men sat at a table together. They laughed and talked in French, their voices rising. Good old Joseph. What about the little Denise, mon vieux? Do you remember that saker pig of a horse that led us all down at Auteuil? It was all very hearty, very much in character, and incongruously out of place. The woman with the beautiful face sat alone at a table in the corner. She looked at no one. Afterwards, as Poirot was sitting in the lounge, the manager came to him and was confidential. Monsieur must not judge the hotel too hardly. It was out of the season. No one came here till the end of July. That lady, Monsieur had noticed her, perhaps? She came at this time every year. Her husband had been killed climbing 3 years ago. It was very sad, they had been very devoted. She came here always before the season commenced, so as to be quiet. It was a sacred pilgrimage. The elderly gentleman was a famous doctor. Dr. Karl Lutz, from Vienna. He had come here, so he said, for quiet and repose. It is peaceful, yes, agreed Hercule Poirot. And CES Messrs there? He indicated the three horsey men. Do they also seek repose, do you think? The manager shrugged his shoulders. Again there appeared in his eyes that worried look. He said vaguely, "Ah, the tourists, they wish always a new experience. The altitude, that alone is a new sensation." It was not, Poirot thought, a very pleasant sensation. He was conscious of his own rapidly beating heart. The lines of a nursery rhyme ran idiotically through his mind. Up above the world so high. Like a tea tray in the sky. Schwartz came into the lounge. His eyes brightened when he saw Poirot. He came over to him at once. "I've been talking to that doctor. He speaks English after a fashion. He's a Jew, been turned out of Austria by the Nazis. Say, I guess those people are just crazy. This Dr. Lutz was quite a big man, I gather, nerve specialist, psychoanalysis, that kind of stuff. His eyes went to where the tall woman was looking out of a window at remorseless mountains. He lowered his voice. I got her name from the waiter. She's a Madame Grandier. Her husband was killed climbing. That's why she comes here. I sort of feel, don't you, that we ought to do something about it, try to take her out of herself? Hercule Poirot said, if I were you I should not attempt it. But the friendliness of Mr. Schwartz was indefatigable. Poirot saw him make his overtures, saw the remorseless way in which they were rebuffed. The two stood together for a minute silhouetted against the light. The woman was taller than Schwartz. Her head was thrown back and her expression was cold and forbidding. He did not hear what she said, but Schwartz came back looking crestfallen. Nothing doing, he said. He added wistfully, seems to me that as we're all human beings together there's no reason we shouldn't be friendly to one another. Don't you agree, Mr. I don't know your name? My name, said Poirot, is Poirier. He added, I am a silk merchant from Lyons. I'd like to give you my card, M. Poirier, and if ever you come to Fountain Springs you'll be sure of a welcome. Poirot accepted the card, clapped his hand to his own pocket, murmured, alas, I have not a card on me at the moment. That night, when he went to bed, Poirot read through Lamentuel's letter carefully before replacing it, neatly folded, in his wallet. As he got into bed he said to himself, it is curious, I wonder if. Gustave the waiter brought Hercule Poirot his breakfast of coffee and rolls. He was apologetic over the coffee. Monsieur comprehends, does he not, that at this altitude it is impossible to have the coffee really hot? Lamentably, it boils too soon. Poirot murmured, one must accept these vagaries of nature's with fortitude. Gustave murmured, Monsieur is a philosopher. He went to the door, but instead of leaving the room, he took one quick look outside, then shut the door again and returned to the bedside. He said, M. Hercule Poirot? I am Drouet, Inspector of Police. Ah, said Poirot, I had already suspected as much. Drouet lowered his voice. M. Poirot, something very grave has occurred. There has been an accident to the funicular. An accident? Poirot sat up. What kind of an accident? Nobody has been injured. It happened in the night. It was occasioned, perhaps, by natural causes, a small avalanche that swept down boulders and rocks. But it is possible that there was human agency at work. One does not know. In any case, the result is that it will take many days to repair and that in the meantime we are cut off up here. So early in the season, when the snow is still heavy, it is impossible to communicate with the valley below. Hercule Poirot sat up in bed. He said softly, that is very interesting. The inspector nodded. Yes, he said. It shows that our commissaire's information was correct. Marescot has a rendezvous here. And he has made sure that that rendezvous shall not be interrupted. Hercule Poirot cried impatiently, but it is fantastic. I agree. Inspector Drouet threw up his hands. It does not make the common sense, but there it is. This Mariscod, you know, is a fantastic creature. Myself, he nodded, I think he is mad. Poirot said, a madman and a murderer. Drouet said dryly, it is not amusing, I agree. Poirot said slowly, but if he has a rendezvous here, on this ledge of snow high above the world, then it also follows that Mariscot himself is here already, since communications are now cut. Drouet said quietly, I know. Both men were silent for a minute or two. Then Poirot asked, Dr. Lutz? Can he be Mariscot? Drouet shook his head. I do not think so. There is a real Dr. Lutz. I have seen his pictures in the papers, a distinguished and well-known man. This man resembles these photographs closely, Poirot murmured. If Mariscot is an artist in disguise, he might play the part successfully. Yes, but is he? I never heard of him as an expert in disguise. He has not the guile and cunning of the serpent. He is a wild boar, ferocious, terrible, who charges in blind fury. Poirot said, all the same. Drouet agreed quickly. Ah yes, he is a fugitive from justice. Therefore he is forced to dissemble. So he may, in fact he must be, more or less disguised. You have his description? The other shrugged his shoulders. Roughly only. The official Bertillon photograph and measurements were to have been sent up to me today. I know only that he is a man of 30-odd, of a little over medium height and of dark complexion. No distinguishing marks. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. That could apply to anybody. What about the American, Schwartz? I was going to ask you that. You have spoken with him, and you have lived, I think, much with the English and the Americans. To a casual glance he appears to be the normal traveling American. His passport is in order. It is perhaps strange that he should elect to come here, but Americans when traveling are quite incalculable. What do you think yourself? Hercule Poirot shook his head in perplexity. He said, on the surface, at any rate, he appears to be a harmless, slightly over-friendly man. He might be a bore, but it seems difficult to regard him as a danger. He went on, but there are 3 more visitors here. The inspector nodded, his face suddenly eager. Yes, and they are the type we are looking for. I'll take my oath, Emma Poirot, that those 3 men are at any rate members of Mariscot's gang. They're racecourse toughs if I ever saw them. And one of the 3 may be Mariscot himself. Hercule Poirot reflected. He recalled the 3 faces. One was a broad face with overhanging brows and a fat jowl, a hoggish, bestial face. One was lean and thin with a sharp, narrow face and cold eyes. The third man was a pasty-faced fellow with a slight dandiacal air. Yes, one of the 3 might well be Mariscot, but if so, the question came insistently, why? Why should Mariscot and 2 members of his gang journey together and ascend into a rat trap on a mountainside? A meeting surely could be arranged in safer and less fantastic surroundings, in a cafe, in a railway station, in a crowded cinema, in a public park, somewhere where there were exits in plenty, not here far above the world in a wilderness of snow. Something of this he tried to convey to Inspector Drouet, and the latter agreed readily enough. But yes, it is fantastic. It does not make sense. If it is a rendezvous, Why do they travel together? No, indeed, it does not make sense. Drouet said, his face worried. In that case, we have to examine a second supposition. These three men are members of Marescot's gang and they have come here to meet Marescot himself. Who then is Marescot? Poirot asked. What about the staff of the hotel? Drouet shrugged his shoulders. There is no staff to speak of. There is an old woman who cooks. There is her old husband Jacques. They have been here for 50 years, I should think. There is the waiter whose place I have taken. That is all what Poirot said. The manager, he knows of course who you are? Naturally. It needed his cooperation. Has it struck you, said Hercule Poirot, that he looks worried? The remark seemed to strike Drouet. He said thoughtfully, yes, that is true. It may be that it is merely the anxiety of being involved in police proceedings, but you think it may be more than that? You think that he may know something? It occurred to me. That is all. Drouet said somberly, I wonder. He paused and then went on, could one get it out of him, do you think? Poirot shook his head doubtfully. He said, it would be better, I think, not to let him know of our suspicions. Keep your eye on him, that is all. Drouet nodded. He turned towards the door. You've no suggestions, M. Poirot? I know your reputation. We have heard of you in this country of ours. Poirot said perplexedly, for the moment I can suggest nothing. It is the reason which escapes me, the reason for a rendezvous in this place. In fact, the reason for a rendezvous at all? Money, said Drouet succinctly. He was robbed, then, as well as murdered, this poor fellow Sally? Yes, he had a very large sum of money on him which has disappeared, and the rendezvous is for the purpose of sharing out, you think? It is the most obvious idea. Poirot shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. Yes, but why here? He went on slowly, the worst place possible for a rendezvous of criminals. But it is a place, this, where one might come to meet a woman. Drouet took a step forward eagerly. He said excitedly, you think dash? I think, said Poirot, that Madame Grandier is a very beautiful woman. I think that anyone might well mount 10,000 feet for her sake, that is, if she had suggested such a thing. You know, said Drouet, that's interesting. I never thought of her in connection with the case, after all, she's been to this place several years running. Poirot said gently, yes, and therefore her presence would not cause comment. It would be a reason, would it not, why Rocher's Ned should have been the spot selected? Drouet said excitedly, you've had an idea, M. Poirot. I'll look into that angle. The day passed without incident. Fortunately, the hotel was well provisioned. The manager explained that there need be no anxiety. Supplies were assured. Hercule Poirot endeavored to get into conversation with Dr. Karl Lutz and was rebuffed. The doctor intimated plainly that psychology was his professional preoccupation and that he was not going to discuss it with amateurs. He sat in a corner reading a large German tome on the subconscious and making copious notes and annotations. Hercule Poirot went outside and wandered aimlessly round to the kitchen premises. There he entered into conversation with the old man Jacques, who was surly and suspicious. His wife, the cook, was more forthcoming. Fortunately, she explained to Poirot, there was a large reserve of tinned food, but she herself thought little of food in tins. It was wickedly expensive, and what nourishment could there be in it? The good God had never intended people to live out of tins. The conversation came round to the subject of the hotel staff. Early in July the chambermaids and the extra waiters arrived. But for the next 3 weeks, there would be nobody or next to nobody. Mostly people who came up and had lunch and then went back again. She and Jacques and one waiter could manage that easily. Poirot asked, there was already a waiter here before Gustave came. Was there not? But yes, indeed, a poor kind of a waiter. No skill, no experience. No class at all. How long was he here before Gustave replaced him? A few days only, the inside of a week. Naturally, he was dismissed. We were not surprised. It was bound to come, Poirot murmured. He did not complain unduly. Ah, no, he went quietly enough. After all, what could he expect? This is a hotel of good class. One must have proper service here. Poirot nodded. He asked, where did he go? That Robert, you mean? She shrugged her shoulders. Doubtless back to the obscure café he came from. He went down in the funicular? She looked at him curiously. Naturally. Monsieur. What other way is there to go? Poirot asked, did anyone see him go? They both stared at him. Ah! Do you think it likely that one goes to see off an animal like that one gives him the grand farewell? One has one's own affairs to occupy one. Precisely, said Hercule Poirot. He walked slowly away, staring up as he did so at the building above him. A large hotel, with only one wing open at present. In the other wings were many rooms, closed and shuttered, where no one was likely to enter. He came round the corner of the hotel and nearly ran into one of the 3 card-playing men. It was the one with the pasty face and pale eyes. The eyes looked at Poirot without expression. Only the lips curled back a little, showing the teeth like a vicious horse. Poirot passed him and went on. There was a figure ahead of him, the tall, graceful figure of Madame Grandier. He hastened his pace a little and caught her up. He said, this accident to the funicular, it is distressing. I hope, madam, that it has not inconvenienced you? She said, it is a matter of indifference to me. Her voice was very deep, a full contralto. She did not look at Poirot. She swerved aside and went into the hotel by a small side door. Hercule Poirot went to bed early. He was awakened some time after midnight. Someone was fumbling with the lock of the door. He sat up, putting on the light. At the same moment the lock yielded to manipulation and the door swung open. 3 men stood there, the 3 card-playing men. They were, Poirot thought, slightly drunk. Their faces were foolish and yet malevolent. He saw the gleam of a razor blade. The big thick-set man advanced. He spoke in a growling voice. Sacred pig of a detective! Bah! He burst into a torrent of profanity. The three of them advanced purposefully on the defenseless man in the bed. "We'll carve him up, boys." "Eh, little horses?" "We'll slash Monsieur Detective's face open for him." "He won't be the first one tonight." They came on, steady, purposeful, the razor blades flashed. And then, startling in its crisp transatlantic tones, a voice said, "Stick 'em up." They swerved round. Schwartz, dressed in a peculiarly vivid set of striped pajamas, stood in the doorway. In his hand he held an automatic. "Stick 'em up, guys." "I'm pretty good at shooting." He pressed the trigger, and a bullet sang past the big man's ear and buried itself in the woodwork of the window. Hercule Poirot was out of bed in a flash. He collected the gleaming weapons and passed his hands over the three men's bodies to make sure they were not armed. Schwartz said, "Now then, march. There's a big cupboard just along the corridor. No window in it. Just the thing." He marched them into it and turned the key on them. He swung round to Poirot, his voice breaking with pleasurable emotion. "If that doesn't just show? Do you know, M. Poirier, there were folks in Fountain Springs who laughed at me because I said I was going to take a gun abroad with me." "Where do you think you're going?" they asked. "Into the jungle?" "Well, sir, I'd say the laugh is with me. Did you ever see such an ugly bunch of toughs?" Poirot said, "My dear Mr. Schwartz, you appeared in the nick of time. It might have been a drama on the stage. I am very much in your debt." "That's nothing. Where do we go from here?" "We ought to turn these boys over to the police, and that's just what we can't do. It's a knotty problem. Maybe we'd better consult the manager." Hercule Poirot said, "Ah, the manager. I think first we will consult the waiter, Gustave, alias Inspector Drouet." "But yes, the waiter Gustave is really a detective." Schwartz stared at him. "So that's why they did it." "That is why who did what?" "This bunch of crooks got to you second on the list. They'd already carved up Gustave." "What?" "Come with me. The doc's busy on him now." Drouet's room was a small one on the top floor. Dr. Lutz, in a dressing gown, was busy bandaging the injured man's face. He turned his head as they entered. "Ah, it is you, Mr. Schwartz? A nasty business, this. What butchers! What inhuman monsters!" Drouet lay still, moaning faintly. Schwartz asked, "Is he in danger?" "He will not die if that is what you mean. But he must not speak, there must be no excitement. I have dressed the wounds, there will be no risk of septicemia." 3 pairs of hands were raised rapidly. Schwartz said, "Can I trouble you, M. Poirier?" The 3 men left the room together. Schwartz said to Poirot, "Did you say Gustave was a police officer?" Hercule Poirot nodded. "But what was he doing up at Rocher's Nedge?" "He was engaged in tracking down a very dangerous criminal." In a few words Poirot explained the situation. Dr. Lutz said, "Mariscade? I read about the case in the paper. I should much like to meet that man. There is some deep abnormality there. I should like to know the particulars of his childhood. For myself, said Hercule Poirot, I should like to know exactly where he is at this minute. Schwartz said, Isn't he one of the three we locked in the cupboard? Poirot said in a dissatisfied voice, It is possible, yes. But me, I am not sure. I have an idea. She broke off, staring down at the carpet. It was of a light buff color and there were marks on it of a deep rusty brown. Hercule Poirot said, Footsteps, footsteps that have trodden, I think, in blood, and they lead from the unused wing of the hotel. Come, we must be quick. They followed him, through a swing door and along a dim, dusty corridor. They turned the corner of it, still following the marks on the carpet until the tracks led them to a half-open doorway. Poirot pushed the door open and entered. He uttered a sharp, horrified exclamation. The room was a bedroom. The bed had been slept in and there was a tray of food on the table. In the middle of the floor lay the body of a man. He was of just over middle height and he had been attacked with savage and unbelievable ferocity. There were a dozen wounds on his arms and chest, and his head and face had been battered almost to a pulp. Schwartz gave a half-stifled exclamation and turned away looking as though he might be sick. Dr. Lutz uttered a horrified exclamation in German. Schwartz said faintly, Who is this guy? Does anyone know? I fancy, said Poirot, that he was known here as Robert, a rather unskillful waiter. Lutz had gone nearer, bending over the body. He pointed with a finger. There was a paper pinned to the dead man's breast. It had some words scrawled on it in ink. Mariscod will kill no more, nor will he rob his friends. Schwartz ejaculated, Mariscod? So this is Mariscod. But what brought him up here to this out-of-the-way spot? And why do you say his name is Robert? Poirot said, He was here masquerading as a waiter, and by all accounts he was a very bad waiter. So bad that no one was surprised when he was given the sack. He left, presumably to return to Andermatt. But nobody saw him go. Lutz said in his low rumbling voice, So, and what do you think happened? Poirot replied, I think we have here the explanation of a certain worried expression on the hotel manager's face. Mariscod must have offered him a big bribe to allow him to remain hidden in the unused part of the hotel. He added thoughtfully, but the manager was not happy about it. Oh no, he was not happy at all, and Mariscod continued to live in this unused wing with no one but the manager knowing about it? So it seems. It would be quite possible, you know. Dr. Lutz said, And why was he killed? And who killed him? Schwartz cried, That's easy. He was to share out the money with his gang. He didn't. He double-crossed them. He came here, to this out-of-the-way place, to lie low for a while. He thought it was the last place in the world they'd ever think of. He was wrong. Somehow or other they got wise to it and followed him. He touched the dead body with the tip of his shoe. And they settled his account like this. Hercule Poirot murmured, Yes, it was not quite the kind of rendezvous we thought, Dr. Lutz said irritably. These hows and whys may be very interesting, but I am concerned with our present position. Here we have a dead man. I have a sick man on my hands and a limited amount of medical supplies. and we are cut off from the world. For how long? Schwartz added, and we've got 3 murderers locked in a cupboard. It's what I'd call kind of an interesting situation, Dr. Lutz said. What do we do? Poirot said, first, we get hold of the manager. He is not a criminal, that one, only a man who was greedy for money. He is a coward, too. He will do everything we tell him. My good friend Jacques, or his wife, will perhaps provide some cord. Our 3 miscreants must be placed where we can guard them in safety until the day when help comes. I think that Mr. Schwartz's automatic will be effective in carrying out any plans we may make. Dr. Lutz said, and I? What do I do? You, doctor, said Poirot gravely, will do all you can for your patient. The rest of us will employ ceaseless vigilance and wait. There is nothing else we can do. It was 3 days later that a little party of men appeared in front of the hotel in the early hours of the morning. It was Hercule Poirot who opened the front door to them with a flourish. Welcome, mon vieux. Monsieur Lamentoul, commissaire of police, seized Poirot by both hands. Ah, my friend, with what emotion I greet you. What stupendous events, what emotions you have passed through. And we below. Our anxiety, our fears, knowing nothing, fearing everything. No wireless, no means of communication. To heliograph, that was indeed a stroke of genius on your part. No, no, Poirot endeavored to look modest. After all, when the inventions of man fail, one falls back upon nature. There is always the sun in the sky. The little party filed into the hotel. Lamentoul said, "We are not expected?" His smile was somewhat grim. Poirot smiled also. He said, "But no. It is believed that the funicular is not nearly repaired yet." Lamentoul said with emotion, "Ah, this is a great day." "There is no doubt, you think? It is really Marescot?" "It is Marescot all right. Come with me." They went up the stairs, a door opened and Schwartz came out in his dressing gown. He stared when he saw the men. "I heard voices," he explained. "Why, what's this?" Hercule Poirot said grandiloquently, "Help has come. Accompany us, monsieur. This is a great moment." He started up the next flight of stairs. Schwartz said, "Are you going up to Drouet? How is he, by the way?" Dr. Lutz reported him going well last night. They came to the door of Drouet's room. Poirot flung it open. He announced, "Here is your wild boar, gentlemen. Take him alive and see to it that he does not cheat the guillotine." The man in the bed, his face still bandaged, started up. But the police officers had him by the arms before he could move. Schwartz cried bewildered, "But that's Gustave the waiter, that's Inspector Drouet, it is Gustave, yes, but it is not Drouet." Drouet was the first waiter, the waiter Robert who was imprisoned in the unused part of the hotel and whom Marescot killed the same night as the attack was made on me. Over breakfast, Poirot explained gently to the bewildered American. "You comprehend, there are certain things one knows quite certainly in the course of one's profession. One knows, for instance, the difference between a detective and a murderer. Gustav was no waiter, that I suspected at once, but equally he was not a policeman. I have dealt with policemen all my life and I know. He could pass as a detective to an outsider, but not to a man who was a policeman himself. And so, at once, I was suspicious. That evening, I did not drink my coffee. I poured it away. And I was wise. Late that evening a man came into my room, came in with the easy confidence of one who knows that the man whose room he is searching is drugged. He looked through my affairs and he found the letter in my wallet, where I had left it for him to find. The next morning Gustav comes into my room with my coffee. He greets me by name and acts his part with complete assurance. But he is anxious, horribly anxious, for somehow or other the police have got on his track. They have learned where he is, and that is for him a terrible disaster. It upsets all his plans. He is caught up here like a rat in a trap. Schwartz said, "The damn fool thing was ever to come here." Why did he? Poirot said gravely, "It is not so foolish as you think." He had urgent need, of a retired spot, away from the world, where he could meet a certain person, and where a certain happening could take place. What person? Dr. Lutz. Dr. Lutz? Is he a crook too? Dr. Lutz is really Dr. Lutz, but he is not a nerve specialist, not a psychoanalyst. He is a surgeon, my friend, a surgeon who specializes in facial surgery. That is why he was to meet Marescott here. He is poor now, turned out of his country. He was offered a huge fee to meet a man here and change that man's appearance by means of his surgical skill. He may have guessed that that man was a criminal, but if so, he shut his eyes to the fact. Realize this, they dared not risk a nursing home in some foreign country. No, up here, where no one ever comes so early in the season except for an odd visit, where the manager is a man in need of money who can be bribed, was an ideal spot. But, as I say, matters went wrong. Marescott was betrayed. The three men, his bodyguard, who were to meet him here and look after him had not yet arrived, but Marescott acts at once. The police officer who is pretending to be a waiter is kidnapped and Marescott takes his place. The gang arrange for the funicular to be wrecked. It is a matter of time. The following evening Drouet is killed and a paper is pinned on the dead body. It is hoped that by the time that communications are established with the world Drouet's body may have been buried as that of Marescott. Dr. Lutz performs his operation without delay. But one man must be silenced, Hercule Poirot, so the gang are sent to attack me. Thanks to you, my friend Hercule Poirot bowed gracefully to Schwartz, who said, "So you're really Hercule Poirot?" "Precisely." "And you were never fooled by that body for a minute? You knew all along that it wasn't Marescott?" "Certainly." "Why didn't you say so?" Hercule Poirot's face was suddenly stern. "Because I wanted to be quite sure of handing the real Marescott over to the police." He murmured below his breath, "To capture alive the wild boar of Aramanthia." The Augean Stables is part of Agatha Christie's The Labors of Hercules series, where each story parallels one of the 12 labors of the mythological hero Hercules. The situation is an extremely delicate one, M. Poirot. A faint smile flitted across Hercule Poirot's lips. He almost replied, "It always is." Instead, he composed his face and put on what might be described as a bedside manner of extreme discretion. Sir George Conway proceeded weightily. Phrases fell easily from his lips: the extreme delicacy of the government's position, the interests of the public, the solidarity of the party, the necessity of presenting a united front, the power of the press, the welfare of the country. It all sounded well, and meant nothing. Hercule Poirot felt that familiar aching of the jaw when one longs to yawn and politeness forbids. He had felt the same sometimes when reading the parliamentary debates. But on those occasions there had been no need to restrain his yawns. He steeled himself to endure patiently. He felt, at the same time, a sympathy for Sir George Conway. The man obviously wanted to tell him something, and as obviously had lost the art of simple narration. Words had become to him a means of obscuring facts, not of revealing them. He was an adept in the art of the useful phrase, that is to say, the phrase that falls soothingly on the ear and is quite empty of meaning. The words rolled on. Poor Sir George became quite red in the face. He shot a desperate glance at the other man sitting at the head of the table, and that other man responded. Edward Ferrier said, "All right, George. I'll tell him." Hercule Poirot shifted his gaze from the Home Secretary to the Prime Minister. He felt a keen interest in Edward Ferrier, an interest aroused by a chance phrase from an old man of 82. Professor Fergus MacLeod, after disposing of a chemical difficulty in the conviction of a murderer, had touched for a moment on politics, on the retirement of the famous and beloved John Hammett. Now Lord Cornworthy, his son-in-law, Edward Ferrier, had been asked to form a cabinet. As politicians go, he was a young man, under 50. Professor MacLeod had said, "Ferrier was once one of my students. He's a sound man." That was all, but to Hercule Poirot it represented a good deal. If MacLeod called a man sound, it was a testimonial to character compared with which no popular or press enthusiasm counted at all. It coincided, it was true, with the popular estimate. Edward Ferrier was considered sound, just that, not brilliant, not great, not a particularly eloquent orator, not a man of deep learning. He was a sound man, a man bred in the tradition, a man who had married John Hammett's daughter, who had been John Hammett's right-hand man, and who could be trusted to carry on the government of the country in the John Hammett tradition. For John Hammett was particularly dear to the people and press of England. He represented every quality which was dear to Englishmen. People said of him, "One does feel that Hammett's honest." Anecdotes were told of his simple home life, of his fondness for gardening. Corresponding to Baldwin's pipe and Chamberlain's umbrella, there was John Hammett's raincoat. He always carried it, a weather-worn garment. It stood as a symbol of the English climate, of the prudent forethought of the English race, of their attachment to old possessions. Moreover, in his bluff British way, John Hammett was an orator. His speeches, quietly and earnestly delivered, contained those simple sentimental clichés which are so deeply rooted in the English heart. Foreigners sometimes criticize them as being both hypocritical and unbearably noble. John Hammett did not in the least mind being noble, in a sporting, public school, deprecating fashion. Moreover, he was a man of fine presence, tall, upstanding, with fair coloring and very bright blue eyes. His mother had been a Dane, and he himself had been for many years First Lord of the Admiralty, which gave rise to his nickname of the Viking. when at last ill health forced him to give up the reins of office, deep uneasiness was felt. Who would succeed him? The brilliant Lord Charles Delafield? Too brilliant, England didn't need brilliance. Evan Whitler? Clever, but perhaps a little unscrupulous. John Potter? The sort of man who might fancy himself as dictator, and we didn't want any dictators in this country, thank you very much, so a sigh of relief went up when the quiet Edward Ferrier assumed office. Ferrier was all right. He had been trained by the old man, he had married the old man's daughter. In the classic British phrase, Ferrier would carry on. Hercule Poirot studied the quiet, dark-faced man with the low, pleasant voice. Lean and dark and tired-looking, Edward Ferrier was saying, "Perhaps, Emma Poirot, you are acquainted with a weekly periodical called the X-Ray News?" "I have glanced at it," admitted Poirot, blushing slightly. The Prime Minister said, "Then you know more or less of what it consists." Semi-libelous matter. Snappy paragraphs hinting at sensational secret history, some of them true, some of them harmless, but all served up in a spicy manner. Occasionally he paused and then said, his voice altering a little, occasionally something more. Hercule Poirot did not speak. Ferrier went on, "For 2 weeks now there have been hints of impending disclosures of a first-class scandal in the highest political circles. Astonishing revelations of corruption and jobbery," Hercule Poirot said, shrugging his shoulders, "a common trick. When the actual revelations come they usually disappoint the cravers after sensation badly." Ferrier said dryly, "These will not disappoint them." Hercule Poirot asked, "You know then, what these revelations are going to be?" With a fair amount of accuracy, Edward Ferrier paused a minute, then he began speaking. Carefully, methodically, he outlined the story. It was not an edifying story. Accusations of shameless chicanery, of shared juggling, of a gross misuse of party funds. The charges were leveled against the late Prime Minister, John Hammett. They showed him to be a dishonest rascal, a gigantic confidence trickster, who had used his position to amass for himself a vast private fortune. The Prime Minister's quiet voice stopped at last. The Home Secretary groaned. He spluttered out, "It's monstrous, monstrous. This fellow, Perry, who edits the rag, ought to be shot." Hercule Poirot said, "These so-called revelations are to appear in the X-Ray News?" "Yes." "What steps do you propose to take about them?" Ferrier said slowly, "They constitute a private attack on John Hammett. It is open to him to sue the paper for libel." "Will he do that?" "No." "Why not?" Ferrier said, "It is probable that there is nothing the X-Ray News would like better. The publicity given them would be enormous, their defense would be fair comment and that the statements complained of were true. The whole business would be exhaustively held up to view in a blaze of limelight. Still, if the case went against them, the damages would be extremely heavy." Ferrier said slowly, "It might not go against them." "Why?" Sir George said primly, "I really think that but Edward Ferrier was already speaking. "Because what they intend to print is the truth." A groan burst from Sir George Conway, outraged at such unparliamentary frankness. He cried out, "Edward, my dear fellow, We don't admit, surely. The ghost of a smile passed over Edward Ferrier's tired face. He said, unfortunately, George, there are times when the stark truth has got to be told. This is one of them. Sir George exclaimed, you understand, M. Poirot, all this is strictly in confidence. Not one word. Ferrier interrupted him. He said, M. Poirot understands that. He went on slowly, what he may not understand is this, the whole future of the People's Party is at stake. John Hammett. M. Poirot was the People's Party. He stood for what it represents to the people of England. He stood for decency and honesty. No one has ever thought us brilliant. We have muddled and blundered. But we have stood for the tradition of doing one's best, and we have stood, too, for fundamental honesty. Our disaster is this, that the man who was our figurehead, the honest man of the people, par excellence, turns out to have been one of the worst crooks of this generation. Another groan burst from Sir George. Poirot asked, you knew nothing of all this? Again the smile flashed across the weary face. Ferrier said, you may not believe me, M. Poirot, but like everyone else, I was completely deceived. I never understood my wife's curious attitude of reserve towards her father. I understand it now. She knew his essential character. He paused and then said, when the truth began to leak out, I was horrified, incredulous. We insisted on my father-in-law's resignation on the grounds of ill health, and we set to work to clean up the mess, shall I say? Sir George groaned, the Augean stables. Poirot started. Ferrier said, it will prove, I fear, too Herculean a task for us. Once the facts become public, there will be a wave of reaction all over the country. The government will fall. There will be a general election, and in all probability Everhard and his party will be returned to power. You know Everhard's policy, Sir George spluttered. A firebrand, a complete firebrand. Ferrier said gravely, Everhard has ability, but he is reckless, belligerent, and utterly tactless. His supporters are inept and vacillating. It would be practically a dictatorship. Hercule Poirot nodded. Sir George bleated out, if only the whole thing can be hushed up. Slowly, the Premier shook his head. It was a movement of defeat. Poirot said, you do not believe that it can be hushed up? Ferrier said, I sent for you, M. Poirot, as a last hope. In my opinion, this business is too big, too many people know about it, for it to be successfully concealed. The only two methods open to us, which are, to put it bluntly, the use of force or the adoption of bribery, cannot really hope to succeed. The Home Secretary compared our troubles with the cleansing of the Augean stables. It needs, M. Poirot, the violence of a river in spate, the disruption of the great natural forces of nature, nothing less, in fact, than a miracle. It needs, in fact, a Hercules, said Poirot, nodding his head with a pleased expression. He added, my name, remember, is Hercule. Edward Ferrier said, can you perform miracles, M. Poirot? It is why you sent for me, is it not? Because you thought that I might? That is true. I realized that if salvation was to be achieved, it could only come through some fantastic and completely unorthodox suggestion. He paused a minute, then he said, but perhaps, M. Poirot, you take an ethical view of the situation? John Hammett was a crook. The legend of John Hammett must be exploded. Can one build an honest house on dishonest foundations? I do not know. But I do know that I want to try. He smiled with a sudden sharp bitterness. The politician wants to remain in office, as usual from the highest motives. Hercule Poirot rose. He said, Monsieur, my experience in the police force has not, perhaps, allowed me to think very highly of politicians. If John Hammond were in office, I would not lift a finger, no, not a little finger. But I know something about you. I have been told, by a man who is really great, one of the greatest scientists and brains of the day, that you are a sound man. I will do what I can. He bowed and left the room. Sir George burst out, well, of all the damned chic dash, but Edward Ferrier, still smiling, said, it was a compliment. On his way downstairs, Hercule Poirot was intercepted by a tall, fair-haired woman. She said, please come into my sitting room, M. Poirot. He bowed and followed her. She shut the door, motioned him to a chair, and offered him a cigarette. She sat down opposite him. She said quietly, you have just seen my husband, and he has told you about my father. Poirot looked at her with attention. He saw a tall woman, still handsome, with character and intelligence in her face. Mrs. Ferrier was a popular figure. As the wife of the Prime Minister, she naturally came in for a good share of the limelight. As the daughter of her father, her popularity was even greater. Dagmar Ferrier represented the popular ideal of English womanhood. She was a devoted wife, a fond mother. She shared her husband's love of country life. She interested herself in just those aspects of public life which were generally felt to be proper spheres of womanly activity. She dressed well, but never in an ostentatiously fashionable manner. She devoted much of her time and activity to large-scale charities. She had inaugurated special schemes for the relief of the wives of unemployed men. She was looked up to by the whole nation and was a most valuable asset to the party. Hercule Poirot said, you must be terribly worried, madam. Oh, I am, you don't know how much. For years I have been dreading something. Poirot said, you had no idea of what was going on actually. She shook her head. No, not in the least. I only knew that my father was not what everyone thought him. I realized, from the time that I was a child, that he was a humbug. Her voice was deep and bitter. She said, it is through marrying me that Edward will lose everything. Poirot said in a quiet voice, have you any enemies, madam? She looked up at him, surprised. Enemies? I don't think so. Poirot said thoughtfully, I think you have. He went on, have you courage, madam? There is a great campaign afoot against your husband and against yourself. You must prepare to defend yourself. She cried, but it doesn't matter about me, only about Edward. Poirot said, the one includes the other. Remember, madam, you are Caesar's wife. He saw her color ebb. She leaned forward. She said, what is it you are trying to tell me? Percy Perry, editor of the X-Ray News, sat behind his desk smoking. He was a small man with a face like a weasel. He was saying in a soft, oily voice, we'll give him the dirt, all right. Lovely, lovely. Oh boy. His second-in-command, a thin, spectacled youth, said uneasily, "You're not nervous? Expecting strong-arm stuff?" "Not them. Haven't got the nerve. Wouldn't do them any good, either. Not the way we've got it farmed out, in this country and on the continent in America," the other said. "They must be in a pretty good stew." "Won't they do anything?" "They'll send someone to talk pretty." A buzzer sounded. Percy Perry picked up a receiver. He said, "Who do you say?" "Right, send him up." He put the receiver down, grinned. "They've got that high-toned Belgian Dick onto it. He's coming up now to do his stuff. Wants to know if we'll play ball." Hercule Poirot came in. He was immaculately dressed, a white camellia in his buttonhole. Percy Perry said, "Pleased to meet you, M. Poirot. On your way to the royal enclosure at Ascot?" "No." "My mistake." Hercule Poirot said, "I am flattered. One hopes to present a good appearance. It is even more important." His eyes roamed innocently over the editor's face and somewhat slovenly attire, when one has few natural advantages. Perry said shortly, "What do you want to see me about?" Poirot leaned forward, tapped him on the knee, and said with a beaming smile, "Blackmail." "What the devil do you mean?" "Blackmail? I have heard, the little bird has told me, that on occasions you have been on the point of publishing certain very damaging statements in your So Spirituel paper. Then, there has been a pleasant little increase in your bank balance, and after all, those statements have not been published." Poirot leaned back and nodded his head in a satisfied sort of way. "Do you realize that what you're suggesting amounts to slander?" Poirot smiled confidently. "I am sure you will not take offense." "I do take offense. As to blackmail, there is no evidence of my ever having blackmailed anybody. No, no, I am quite sure of that." "You misunderstand me. I was not threatening you. I was leading up to a simple question. How much?" "I don't know what you're talking about," said Percy Perry. "A matter of national importance, M. Perry." They exchanged a significant glance. Percy Perry said, "I'm a reformer, M. Poirot. I want to see politics cleaned up. I'm opposed to corruption. Do you know what the state of politics is in this country? The Augean stables, no more, no less." "Tiens," said Hercule Poirot. "You, too, use that phrase." "And what is needed?" went on the editor. "To cleanse those stables is the great purifying flood of public opinion." Hercule Poirot got up. He said, "I applaud your sentiments," he added. "It is a pity that you do not feel in need of money." Percy Perry said hurriedly, "Here, wait a sec, I didn't say that exactly." But Hercule Poirot had gone through the door. His excuse for later events is that he does not like blackmailers. Everett Dashwood, the cheery young man on the staff of the branch, clapped Hercule Poirot affectionately on the back. He said, "There's dirt and dirt, my boy. My dirt's clean dirt, that's all. I was not suggesting that you were on a par with Percy Perry. Damned little bloodsucker. He's a blot on our profession. We'd all down him if we could." It happens, said Hercule Poirot, that I am engaged at the moment on a little matter of clearing up a political scandal, cleaning out the Augean stables, eh? Said Dashwood. Too much for you, my boy. Only hope is to divert the Thames and wash away the Houses of Parliament. You are cynical, said Hercule Poirot, shaking his head. I know the world, that's all. Poirot said, You, I think, are just the man I seek. You have a reckless disposition, you are the good sport, you like something that is out of the usual. And granting all that, I have a little scheme to put into action. If my ideas are right, there is a sensational plot to unmask. That, my friend, shall be a scoop for your paper. Can do, said Dashwood cheerfully. It will concern a scurrilous plot against a woman, better and better. Sex stuff always goes. Then sit down and listen. People were talking. In the Goose and Feathers at Little Wimplington. Well, I don't believe it. John Hammett, he was always an honest man, he wasn't like some of these political folk. That's what they say about all swindlers before they're found out. Thousands, they say he made, out of that Palestine oil business. Just a crook deal, it was. Whole lot of 'em tarred with the same brush. Dirty crooks, every one of 'em. You wouldn't find Everhard doing that. He's one of the old school. But I can't believe as John Hammett was a wrong un. You can't believe all these papers say Ferrier's wife was his daughter. Have you seen what it says about her? They pored over a much-thumped copy of the X-ray News. Caesar's wife? We hear that a certain highly placed political lady was seen in very strange surroundings the other day. Complete with her gigolo. Oh, Dagmar, Dagmar, how could you be so naughty? A rustic voice said slowly, Mrs. Ferrier's not that kind. Gigolo? That's one of these Dago skunks. Another voice said, You never can tell with women. The whole bunch of 'em wrong UNS if you ask me. People were talking. But, darling, I believe it's absolutely true. Naomi had it from Paul and he had it from Andy. She's absolutely depraved. But she was always so terribly dowdy and proper in opening bazaars. Just camouflage, darling. They say she's a nymphomaniac. Well, I mean, it's all in the X-ray News. Oh, not right out, but you can read between the lines. I don't know how they get hold of these things. What do you think of all this political scandal touch? They say her father embezzled the party funds. People were talking. I don't like to think of it, and that's a fact, Mrs. Rogers. I mean, I always thought Mrs. Ferrier was a really nice woman. Do you think all these awful things are true? As I say, I don't like to think it of her. Why, she opened a bazaar in Pelchester only last June. I was as near to her as I am to that sofa. And she had such a pleasant smile. Yes, but what I say is there's no smoke without fire. Well, of course that's true. Oh dear, it seems as though you can't believe in anyone. Edward Ferrier, his face white and strained, said to Poirot, These attacks on my wife. They're scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous. I'm bringing an action against that vile rag. Hercule Poirot said, I do not advise you to do so. But these damned lies have got to be stopped. Are you sure they are lies? God damn you, yes. Poirot said, his head held a little on one side. What does your wife say? For a moment Ferrier looked taken aback. She says it is best to take no notice. But I can't do that. Everybody is talking. Hercule Poirot said, yes, everybody is talking. And then came the small bald announcement in all the papers. Mrs. Ferrier has had a slight nervous breakdown. She has gone to Scotland to recuperate. Conjectures, rumors, positive information that Mrs. Ferrier was not in Scotland, had never been to Scotland, stories, scandalous stories, of where Mrs. Ferrier really was. And again, people talking. I tell you Andy saw her. At that frightful place. She was drunk or doped and with an awful Argentine gigolo, Ramon. You know. More talking. Mrs. Ferrier had gone off with an Argentine dancer. She had been seen in Paris, doped. She had been taking drugs for years. She drank like a fish. Slowly the righteous mind of England, at first unbelieving, had hardened against Mrs. Ferrier. Seemed as though there must be something in it. That wasn't the sort of woman to be the Prime Minister's wife. A Jezebel, that's what she is, nothing better than a Jezebel. And then came the camera records. Mrs. Ferrier, photographed in Paris, lying back in a nightclub, her arm twined familiarly over the shoulder of a dark, olive-skinned, vicious-looking young man. Other snapshots, half naked on a beach, her head on the lounge lizard's shoulder. And underneath, Mrs. Ferrier has a good time. 2 days later an action for libel was brought against the X-ray News. The case for the prosecution was opened by Sir Mortimer Inglewood, K.C. He was dignified and full of righteous indignation. Mrs. Ferrier was the victim of an infamous plot, a plot only to be equaled by the famous case of the Queen's necklace familiar to readers of Alexander Dumas. That plot had been engineered to lower Queen Marie Antoinette in the eyes of the populace. This plot, also, had been engineered to discredit a noble and virtuous lady who was in this country in the position of Caesar's wife. Sir Mortimer spoke with bitter disparagement of fascists and communists, both of whom sought to undermine democracy by every unfair machination known. He then proceeded to call witnesses. The first was the Bishop of Northumbria, Dr. Henderson. The Bishop of Northumbria was one of the best-known figures in the English Church, a man of great saintliness and integrity of character. He was broad-minded, tolerant, and a fine preacher. He was loved and revered by all who knew him. He went into the box and swore that between the dates mentioned Mrs. Edward Ferrier had been staying in the palace with himself and his wife. Worn out by her activities and good works, she had been recommended a thorough rest. Her visit had been kept a secret so as to obviate any worry from the press. An eminent doctor followed the bishop and deposed to having ordered Mrs. Ferrier rest and complete absence from worry. A local general practitioner gave evidence to the effect that he had attended Mrs. Ferrier at the palace. The next witness called was Thelma Anderson. A thrill went round the court when she entered the witness box. Everyone realized at once what a strong resemblance the woman bore to Mrs. Edward Ferrier. "Your name is Thelma Anderson?" "Yes." "You are a Danish subject?" "Yes." Copenhagen is my home. And you formerly worked at a cafe there? Yes, sir. Please tell us in your own words what happened on the March 18th last. There is a gentleman who comes to my table there, an English gentleman. He tells me he works for an English paper, the X-Ray News. You are sure he mentioned that name, X-Ray News? Yes, I am sure, because, you see, I think at first it must be a medical paper, but no, it seems not so. Then he tells me there is an English film actress who wants to find a stand-in, and that I am just the type. I do not go to the pictures much, and I do not recognize the name he says, but he tells me, yes, she is very famous, and that she has not been well and so she wants someone to appear as her in public places. And for that she will pay very much money. How much money did this gentleman offer you? £500 in English money. I do not at first believe. I think it is some trick, but he pays me at once half the money. So then, I give in my notice where I work. The tale went on. She had been taken to Paris, supplied with smart clothes, and had been provided with an escort. A very nice Argentinian gentleman, very respectful, very polite. It was clear that the woman had thoroughly enjoyed herself. She had flown over to London and been taken there to certain nightclubs by her olive-skinned cavalier. She had been photographed in Paris with him. Some of the places to which she had gone were not, she admitted, quite nice. Indeed, they were not respectable. And some of the photographs taken, they too, had not been very nice, but these things, they had told her, were necessary for advertisement, and Señor Ramon himself had always been most respectful. In answer to questioning, she declared that the name of Mrs. Ferrier had never been mentioned and that she had had no idea that it was that lady she was supposed to be understudying. She had meant no harm. She identified certain photographs which were shown to her as having been taken of her in Paris and on the Riviera. There was the hallmark of absolute honesty about Thelma Anderson. She was quite clearly a pleasant, but slightly stupid woman. Her distress at the whole thing, now that she understood it, was patent to everyone. The defense was unconvincing. A frenzied denial of having any dealings with the woman Anderson. The photos in question had been brought to the London office and had been believed to be genuine. Sir Mortimer's closing speech roused enthusiasm. He described the whole thing as a dastardly political plot, formed to discredit the Prime Minister and his wife. All sympathy would be extended to the unfortunate Mrs. Ferrier. The verdict, a foregone conclusion, was given amidst unparalleled scenes. Damages were assessed at an enormous figure. As Mrs. Ferrier and her husband and father left the court, they were greeted by the appreciative roars of a vast crowd. Edward Ferrier grasped Poirot warmly by the hand. He said, "I thank you, M. Poirot, 1,000 times. Well, that finishes the X-Ray News. Dirty little rag. They're wiped out completely. Serves them right for cooking up such a scurrilous plot. Against Dagmar, too, the kindliest creature in the world. Thank goodness you managed to expose the whole thing, for the wicked rap it was. What put you on to the idea that they might be using a double?" "It is not a new idea," Poirot reminded him. "It was employed successfully in the case of Jeanne de la Motte when she impersonated Marie Antoinette." "I know. I must reread The Queen's Necklace. But how did you actually find the woman they were employing? I looked for her in Denmark, and I found her there. But why Denmark? Because Mrs. Ferrier's grandmother was a Dane, and she herself is a markedly Danish type. And there were other reasons. The resemblance is certainly striking. What a devilish idea! I wonder how the little rat came to think of it. Poirot smiled. But he did not. He tapped himself on the chest. I thought of it. Edward Ferrier stared. I don't understand. What do you mean? Poirot said, we must go back to an older story than that of the Queen's necklace, to the cleansing of the Augean stables. What Hercules used was a river, that is to say one of the great forces of nature. Modernize that. What is a great force of nature? Sex, is it not? It is the sex angle that sells stories, that makes news. Give people scandal allied to sex and it appeals far more than any mere political chicanery or fraud. Eh bien, that was my task. First to put my own hands in the mud like Hercules to build up a dam that should turn the course of that river. A journalistic friend of mine aided me. He searched Denmark until he found a suitable person to attempt the impersonation. He approached her, casually mentioned the X-ray news to her, hoping she would remember it. She did. And so, what happened? Mud, a great deal of mud. Caesar's wife is bespattered with it. Far more interesting to everybody than any political scandal. And the result, the denouement? Why, reaction. Virtue vindicated. The pure woman cleared. A great tide of romance and sentiment sweeping through the Augean stables. If all the newspapers in the country publish the news of John Hammett's defalcations now, no one will believe it. It will be put down as another political plot to discredit the government. Edward Ferrier took a deep breath. For a moment Hercule Poirot came nearer to being physically assaulted than at any other time in his career. My wife. You dared to use her dash. Fortunately, perhaps, Mrs. Ferrier herself entered the room at this moment. Well, she said. That went off very well. Dagmar, did you know all along? Of course. Dear, said Dagmar Ferrier. And she smiled, the gentle, maternal smile of a devoted wife. And you never told me. But, Edward, you would never have let M. Poirot do it. Indeed, I would not. Dagmar smiled. That's what we thought. We? I and M. Poirot. She smiled at Hercule Poirot and at her husband. She added, I had a very restful time with the dear bishop. I feel full of energy now. They want me to christen the new battleship at Liverpool next month. I think it would be a popular thing to do. The Stymphalian Birds is part of Agatha Christie's The Labors of Hercules collection, where each story parallels one of the mythological labors of Hercules. Harold Waring noticed them first walking up the path from the lake. He was sitting outside the hotel on the terrace. The day was fine, the lake was blue, and the sun shone. Harold was smoking a pipe and feeling that the world was a pretty good place. His political career was shaping well. An undersecretaryship at the age of 30 was something to be justly proud of. It had been reported that the Prime Minister had said to someone that young Waring would go far. Harold was, not unnaturally, elated. Life presented itself to him in rosy colors. He was young, sufficiently good-looking, in first-class condition, and quite unencumbered with romantic ties. He had decided to take a holiday in Czechoslovakia so as to get right off the beaten track and have a real rest from everyone and everything. The hotel at Lake Stemka, though small, was comfortable and not overcrowded. The few people there were mostly foreigners. So far the only other English people were an elderly woman, Mrs. Rice, and her married daughter, Mrs. Clayton. Harold liked them both. Elsie Clayton was pretty in a rather old-fashioned style. She made up very little, if at all, and was gentle and rather shy. Mrs. Rice was what is called a woman of character. She was tall, with a deep voice and a masterful manner, but she had a sense of humor and was good company. Her life was clearly bound up in that of her daughter. Harold had spent some pleasant hours in the company of mother and daughter, but they did not attempt to monopolize him, and relations remained friendly and unexacting between them. The other people in the hotel had not aroused Harold's notice. Usually they were hikers, or members of a motorcoach tour. They stayed a night or two and then went on. He had hardly noticed anyone else until this afternoon. They came up the path from the lake very slowly, and it just happened that at the moment when Harold's attention was attracted to them, a cloud came over the sun. He shivered a little. Then he stared. Surely there was something odd about these two women? They had long, curved noses, like birds, and their faces, which were curiously alike, were quite immobile. Over their shoulders they wore loose cloaks that flapped in the wind like the wings of two big birds. Harold thought to himself, "They are like birds." He added almost without volition, "birds of ill omen." The women came straight up on the terrace and passed close by him. They were not young, perhaps nearer 50 than 40, and the resemblance between them was so close that they were obviously sisters. Their expression was forbidding. As they passed Harold, the eyes of both of them rested on him for a minute. It was a curious, appraising glance, almost inhuman. Harold's impression of evil grew stronger. He noticed the hand of one of the two sisters, a long claw-like hand. Although the sun had come out, he shivered once again. He thought, horrible creatures, like birds of prey. He was distracted from these imaginings by the emergence of Mrs. Rice from the hotel. He jumped up and drew forward a chair. With a word of thanks she sat down and, as usual, began to knit vigorously. Harold asked, "Did you see those two women who just went into the hotel? With cloaks on?" "Yes, I passed them." "Extraordinary creatures, didn't you think?" "Well, yes, perhaps they are rather odd. They only arrived yesterday, I think. Very alike, they must be twins." Harold said, "I may be fanciful, but I distinctly felt there was something evil about them." "How curious. I must look at them more closely and see if I agree with you." She added, "We'll find out from the concierge who they are. Not English, I imagine?" "Oh, no." Mrs. Rice glanced at her watch. She said, "Tea time. I wonder if you'd mind going in and ringing the bell, Mr. Waring?" Certainly, Mrs. Rice. He did so, and then as he returned to his seat he asked, "Where's your daughter this afternoon?" "Elsie? We went for a walk together. Part of the way round the lake and then back through the pine woods. It really was lovely. A waiter came out and received orders for tea." Mrs. Rice went on, her needles flying vigorously. "Elsie had a letter from her husband. She mayn't come down to tea." "Her husband?" Harold was surprised. "Do you know, I always thought she was a widow?" Mrs. Rice shot him a sharp glance. She said dryly, "Oh no, Elsie isn't a widow," she added with strong, "unfortunately." Harold was startled. Mrs. Rice, nodding her head grimly, said, "Drink is responsible for a lot of unhappiness, Mr. Waring." "Does he drink?" "Yes. And a good many other things as well. He's insanely jealous and has a singularly violent temper." She sighed. "It's a difficult world, Mr. Waring. I'm devoted to Elsie, she's my only child, and to see her unhappy isn't an easy thing to bear." Harold said with real emotion, "She's such a gentle creature." "A little too gentle, perhaps." "You mean dash," Mrs. Rice said slowly, "a happy creature is more arrogant." "Elsie's gentleness comes, I think, from a sense of defeat. Life has been too much for her." Harold said with some slight hesitation, "How did she come to marry this husband of hers?" Mrs. Rice answered, "Philip Clayton was a very attractive person. Still has, great charm. He had a certain amount of money, and there was no one to advise us of his real character. I had been a widow for many years. Two women, living alone, are not the best judges of a man's character." Harold said thoughtfully, "No, that's true." He felt a wave of indignation and pity sweep over him. Elsie Clayton could not be more than 25 at the most. He recalled the clear friendliness of her blue eyes, the soft droop of her mouth. He realized, suddenly, that his interest in her went a little beyond friendship. And she was tied to a brute. That evening, Harold joined mother and daughter after dinner. Elsie Clayton was wearing a soft, dull pink dress. Her eyelids, he noticed, were red. She had been crying. Mrs. Rice said briskly, "I found out who your two harpies are, Mr. Waring. Polish ladies, a very good family, so the concierge says." Harold looked across the room to where the Polish ladies were sitting. Elsie said with interest, "Those two women over there? With the henna-dyed hair? They look rather horrible somehow, I don't know why." Harold said triumphantly, "That's just what I thought." Mrs. Rice said with a laugh, "I think you are both being absurd. You can't possibly tell what people are like just by looking at them." Elsie laughed. She said, "I suppose one can't. All the same, I think they're vultures." "Picking out dead men's eyes," said Harold. "Oh, don't," cried Elsie. Harold said quickly, "Sorry." Mrs. Rice said with a smile, "Anyway, they're not likely to cross our path," Elsie said. "We haven't got any guilty secrets." "Perhaps Mr. Waring has," said Mrs. Rice with a twinkle. Harold laughed, throwing his head back. He said, "Not a secret in the world. My life's an open book." And it flashed across his mind, what fools people are who leave the straight path. A clear conscience, that's all one needs in life. With that you can face the world and tell everyone who interferes with you to go to the devil. He felt suddenly very much alive, very strong, very much master of his fate. Harold Waring, like many other Englishmen, was a bad linguist. His French was halting and decidedly British in intonation. Of German and Italian he knew nothing. Up to now, these linguistic disabilities had not worried him. In most hotels on the continent, he had always found, everyone spoke English, so why worry? But in this out-of-the-way spot, where the native language was a form of Slovak and even the concierge only spoke German, it was sometimes galling to Harold when one of his two women friends acted as interpreter for him. Mrs. Rice, who was fond of languages, could even speak a little Slovak. Harold determined that he would set about learning German. He decided to buy some textbooks and spend a couple of hours each morning in mastering the language. The morning was fine, and after writing some letters, Harold looked at his watch and saw there was still time for an hour's stroll before lunch. He went down towards the lake and then turned aside into the pine woods. He had walked there for perhaps 5 minutes when he heard an unmistakable sound. Somewhere not far away a woman was sobbing her heart out. Harold paused a minute, then he went in the direction of the sound. The woman was Elsie Clayton, and was she sitting on a fallen tree with her face buried in her hands and her shoulders quivering with the violence of her grief. Harold hesitated a minute, then he came up to her. He said gently, "Mrs. Clayton, Elsie?" She started violently and looked up at him. Harold sat down beside her. He said with real sympathy, "Is there anything I can do?" "Anything at all?" She shook her head. No, you're very kind." "But there's nothing anyone can do for me," Harold said rather diffidently. "Is it to do with your husband?" She nodded. Then she wiped her eyes and took out her powder compact, struggling to regain command of herself. She said in a quavering voice, "I didn't want Mother to worry. She's so upset when she sees me unhappy, so I came out here to have a good cry." "It's silly." "I know. Crying doesn't help. But sometimes one just feels that life is quite unbearable." Harold said, "I'm terribly sorry." She threw him a grateful glance. Then she said hurriedly, "It's my own fault, of course. I married Philip of my own free will. It's turned out badly. I've only myself to blame," Harold said. "It's very plucky of you to put it like that." Elsie shook her head. "No, I'm not plucky. I'm not brave at all. I'm an awful coward. That's partly the trouble with Philip. I'm terrified of him, absolutely terrified, when he gets in one of his rages." Harold said with feeling, "You ought to leave him." "I daren't. He wouldn't let me." "Nonsense. What about a divorce?" She shook her head slowly. "I've no grounds." She straightened her shoulders. "No, I've got to carry on. I spend a fair amount of time with Mother, you know. Philip doesn't mind that. Especially when we go somewhere off the beaten track like this." She added, the color rising in her cheeks, "You see, part of the trouble is that he's insanely jealous. If I so much as speak to another man, he makes the most frightful scenes." Harold's indignation rose. He had heard many women complain of the jealousy of a husband, and whilst professing sympathy, had been secretly of the opinion that the husband was amply justified. But Elsie Clayton wasn't one of those women. She had never thrown him so much as a flirtatious glance. Elsie drew away from him with a slight shiver. She glanced up at the sky. "The sun's gone in. It's quite cold. We'd better get back to the hotel. It must be nearly lunchtime." They got up and turned in the direction of the hotel. They had walked for perhaps a minute when they overtook a figure going in the same direction. They recognized her by the flapping cloak she wore. It was one of the Polish sisters. They passed her, Harold bowing slightly. She made no response, but her eyes rested on them both for a minute, and there was a certain appraising quality in the glance which made Harold feel suddenly hot. He wondered if the woman had seen him sitting by Elsie on the tree trunk. If so, she probably thought. Well, she looked as though she thought. A wave of indignation overwhelmed him. What foul minds some women had! Odd that the sun had gone in and that they should both have shivered, perhaps just at the moment that that woman was watching them. Somehow, Harold felt a little uneasy. That evening, Harold went to his room a little after 10. The English mail had arrived and he had received a number of letters, some of which needed immediate answers. He got into his pajamas and a dressing gown and sat down at the desk to deal with his correspondence. He had written 3 letters and was just starting on the 4th when the door was suddenly flung open and Elsie Clayton staggered into the room. Harold jumped up, startled. Elsie had pushed the door to behind her and was standing clutching at the chest of drawers. Her breath was coming in great gasps. Her face was the color of chalk. She looked frightened to death. She gasped out, "It's my husband. He arrived unexpectedly. I think he'll kill me. He's mad, quite mad. I came to you. Don't let him find me." She took a step or two forward, swaying so much that she almost fell. Harold put out an arm to support her. As he did so, the door was flung open and a man stood in the doorway. He was of medium height with thick eyebrows and a sleek, dark head. In his hand he carried a heavy car spanner. His voice rose high and shook with rage. He almost screamed the words. "So that Polish woman was right. You are carrying on with this fellow." Elsie cried, "No, no, Philip. It's not true." "You're wrong." Harold thrust the girl swiftly behind him as Philip Clayton advanced on them both. The latter cried, "Wrong. Am I? When I find you here in his room? You she-devil. I'll kill you for this." With a swift, sideways movement he dodged Harold's arm. Elsie, with a cry, ran round the other side of Harold, who swung round to fend the other off, but Philip Clayton had only one idea, to get at his wife. He swerved round again. Elsie, terrified, rushed out of the room. Philip Clayton dashed after her, and Harold, with not a moment's hesitation, followed him. Elsie had darted back into her own bedroom at the end of the corridor. Harold could hear the sound of the key turning in the lock. But it did not turn in time. Before the lock could catch, Philip Clayton wrenched the door open. He disappeared into the room, and Harold heard Elsie's frightened cry. In another minute Harold burst in after them. Elsie was standing at bay against the curtains of the window. As Harold entered, Philip Clayton rushed at her, brandishing the spanner. She gave a terrified cry, then snatching up a heavy paperweight from the desk beside her, she flung it at him. Clayton went down like a log. Elsie screamed. Harold stopped petrified in the doorway. The girl fell on her knees beside her husband. He lay quite still where he had fallen. Outside in the passage, there was the sound of the bolt of one of the doors being drawn back. Elsie jumped up and ran to Harold. Please, please, her voice was low and breathless. Go back to your room. They'll come, they'll find you here. Harold nodded. He took in the situation like lightning. For the moment, Philip Clayton was hors de combat. But Elsie's scream might have been heard. If he were found in her room, it could only cause embarrassment and misunderstanding. Both for her sake and his own, there must be no scandal. As noiselessly as possible, he sprinted down the passage and back into his room. Just as he reached it, he heard the sound of an opening door. He sat in his room for nearly half an hour, waiting. He dared not go out. Sooner or later, he felt sure Elsie would come. There was a light tap on his door. Harold jumped up to open it. It was not Elsie who came in, but her mother, and Harold was aghast at her appearance. She looked suddenly years older. Her gray hair was disheveled, and there were deep black circles under her eyes. He sprang up and helped her to a chair. She sat down, her breath coming painfully. Harold said quickly, "You look all in, Mrs. Rice. Can I get you something?" She shook her head. "No. Never mind me. I'm all right, really. It's only the shock." "Mr. Waring, a terrible thing has happened." Harold asked, "Is Clayton seriously injured?" She caught her breath. "Worse than that. He's dead." The room spun round. A feeling as of icy water trickling down his spine rendered Harold incapable of speech for a moment or two. He repeated dully, "Dead?" Mrs. Rice nodded. She said, and her voice had the flat level tones of complete exhaustion, "The corner of that marble paperweight caught him right on the temple, and he fell back with his head on the iron fender. I don't know which it was that killed him, but he is certainly dead. I have seen death often enough to know." Disaster. That was the word that rang insistently in Harold's brain. Disaster, disaster, disaster. He said vehemently, "It was an accident. I saw it happen." Mrs. Rice said sharply, "Of course it was an accident. I know that. But, is anyone else going to think so? Frankly, I'm frightened, Harold." "This isn't England," Harold said slowly. "I can confirm Elsie's story." Mrs. Rice said, "Yes, and she can confirm yours." That is just it." Harold's brain, naturally a keen and cautious one, saw her point. He reviewed the whole thing and appreciated the weakness of their position. He and Elsie had spent a good deal of their time together. Then there was the fact that they had been seen together in the pine woods by one of the Polish women under rather compromising circumstances. The Polish ladies apparently spoke no English, but they might nevertheless understand it a little. The woman might have known the meaning of words like jealously and husband if she had chanced to overhear their conversation. Anyway, it was clear that it was something she had said to Clayton that had aroused his jealousy. And now, his death. When Clayton had died, he, Harold, had been in Elsie Clayton's room. There was nothing to show that he had not deliberately assaulted Philip Clayton with the paperweight. Nothing to show that the jealous husband had not actually found them together. There was only his word and Elsie's. Would they be believed? A cold fear gripped him. He did not imagine, no, he really did not imagine, that either he or Elsie was in danger of being condemned to death for a murder they had not committed. Surely, in any case, it could only be a charge of manslaughter brought against them. Did they have manslaughter in these foreign countries? But even if they were acquitted of blame, there would have to be an inquiry. It would be reported in all the papers. An English man and woman accused, jealous husband, rising politician. Yes, it would mean the end of his political career. It would never survive a scandal like that, he said on an impulse. Can't we get rid of the body somehow? Plant it somewhere? Mrs. Rice's astonished and scornful look made him blush. She said incisively, "My dear Harold, this isn't a detective story. To attempt a thing like that would be quite crazy." "I suppose it would." He groaned. "What can we do? My God, what can we do?" Mrs. Rice shook her head despairingly. She was frowning, her mind working painfully. Harold demanded, "Isn't there anything we can do? Anything to avoid this frightful disaster?" There. It was out, disaster. Terrible, unforeseen, utterly damning. They stared at each other. Mrs. Rice said hoarsely, "Elsie, my little girl. I'd do anything. It will kill her if she has to go through a thing like this," and she added, "You too, your career, everything." Harold managed to say, "Never mind me." But he did not really mean it. Mrs. Rice went on bitterly, "And all so unfair, so utterly untrue. It's not as though there had ever been anything between you." "I know that well enough," Harold suggested, catching at a straw. "You'll be able to say that at least, that it was all perfectly all right." Mrs. Rice said bitterly, "Yes, if they believe me. But you know what these people out here are like." Harold agreed gloomily. To the continental mind, there would undoubtedly be a guilty connection between himself and Elsie, and all Mrs. Rice's denials would be taken as a mother lying herself black in the face for her daughter. Harold said gloomily, "Yes, we're not in England, worse luck." "Ah." Mrs. Rice lifted her head. "That's true. It's not England. I wonder now if something could be done. Yes." Harold looked at her eagerly. Mrs. Rice said abruptly, "How much money have you got?" "Not much with me." He added, "I could wire for money, of course." Mrs. Rice said grimly, "We may need a good deal. But I think it's worth trying." Harold felt a faint lifting of despair. He said, "What is your idea?" Mrs. Rice spoke decisively. We haven't a chance of concealing the death ourselves, but I do think there's just a chance of hushing it up officially." "You really think so?" Harold was hopeful but slightly incredulous. "Yes, for one thing, the manager of the hotel will be on our side. He'd much rather have the thing hushed up. It's my opinion that in these out-of-the-way curious little Balkan countries you can bribe anyone and everyone, and the police are probably more corrupt than anyone else." Harold said slowly, "Do you know?" "I believe you're right," Mrs. Rice went on. "Fortunately, I don't think anyone in the hotel heard anything." "Who has the room next to Elsie's on the other side from yours?" "The two Polish ladies. They didn't hear anything. They'd have come out into the passage if they had. Philip arrived late. Nobody saw him but the night porter." "Do you know, Harold, I believe it will be possible to hush the whole thing up and get Philip's death certified as due to natural causes. It's just a question of bribing high enough and finding the right man, probably the chief of police." Harold smiled faintly. He said, "It's rather comic opera, isn't it?" "Well, after all, we can but try." Mrs. Rice was energy personified. First the manager was summoned. Harold remained in his room, keeping out of it. He and Mrs. Rice had agreed that the story told had better be that of a quarrel between husband and wife. Elsie's youth and prettiness would command more sympathy. On the following morning various police officials arrived and were shown up to Mrs. Rice's bedroom. They left at midday. Harold had wired for money but otherwise had taken no part in the proceedings. Indeed, he would have been unable to do so since none of these official personages spoke English. At 12 o'clock Mrs. Rice came to his room. She looked white and tired, but the relief on her face told its own story. She said simply, "It's worked. Thank heaven. You've really been marvelous. It seems incredible." Mrs. Rice said thoughtfully, "By the ease with which it went, you might almost think it was quite normal. They practically held out their hands right away. It's rather disgusting, really." Harold said dryly, "This isn't the moment to quarrel with the corruption of the public services." "How much?" "The tariff's rather high." She read out a list of figures. "The chief of police, the commissaire, the agent, the doctor, the hotel manager, the night porter." Harold's comment was merely, "The night porter doesn't get much, does he? I suppose it's mostly a question of gold lace." Mrs. Rice explained, "The manager stipulated that the death should not have taken place in his hotel at all. The official story will be that Philip had a heart attack in the train. He went along the corridor for air, you know how they always leave those doors open, and he fell out on the line. It's wonderful what the police can do when they try." "Well," said Harold, "thank God our police force isn't like that." And in a British and superior mood he went down to lunch. After lunch Harold usually joined Mrs. Rice and her daughter for coffee. He decided to make no change in his usual behavior. This was the first time he had seen Elsie since the night before. She was very pale and was obviously still suffering from shock, but she made a gallant endeavor to behave as usual, uttering small commonplaces about the weather and the scenery. They commented on a new guest who had just arrived, trying to guess his nationality. Harold thought a mustache like that must be French, Elsie said German, and Mrs. Rice thought he might be Spanish. There was no one else but themselves on the terrace with the exception of the two Polish ladies who were sitting at the extreme end, both doing fancy work. As always when he saw them, Harold felt a queer shiver of apprehension pass over him. Those still faces, those curved beaks of noses, those long claw-like hands. A page boy approached and told Mrs. Rice she was wanted. She rose and followed him. At the entrance to the hotel they saw her encounter a police official in full uniform. Elsie caught her breath. "You don't think anything's gone wrong?" Harold reassured her quickly. "Oh no, nothing of that kind." But he himself knew a sudden pang of fear. He said, "Your mother's been wonderful." "I know. Mother is a great fighter. She'll never sit down under defeat." Elsie shivered. "But it is all horrible, isn't it? Now, don't dwell on it. It's all over and done with." Elsie said in a low voice, "I can't forget that it was I who killed him." Harold said urgently, "Don't think of it that way. It was an accident. You know that really." Her face grew a little happier. Harold added, "And anyway it's past. The past is the past. Try never to think of it again." Mrs. Rice came back. By the expression on her face they saw that all was well. "It gave me quite a fright," she said almost gaily, "but it was only a formality about some papers. Everything's all right, my children. We're out of the shadow. I think we might order ourselves a liqueur on the strength of it." The liqueur was ordered and came. They raised their glasses. Mrs. Rice said, "To the future." Harold smiled at Elsie and said, "To your happiness." She smiled back at him and said as she lifted her glass, "And to you, to your success. I'm sure you're going to be a very great man." With the reaction from fear they felt gay, almost light-headed. The shadow had lifted. All was well. From the far end of the terrace the two bird-like women rose. They rolled up their work carefully. They came across the stone flags. With little bows they sat down by Mrs. Rice. One of them began to speak. The other one let her eyes rest on Elsie and Harold. There was a little smile on her lips. It was not, Harold thought, a nice smile. He looked over at Mrs. Rice. She was listening to the Polish woman, and though he couldn't understand a word, the expression on Mrs. Rice's face was clear enough. All the old anguish and despair came back. She listened and occasionally spoke a brief word. Presently the two sisters rose, and with stiff little bows went into the hotel. Harold leaned forward. He said hoarsely, "What is it?" Mrs. Rice answered him in the quiet, hopeless tones of despair. "Those women are going to blackmail us. They heard everything last night. And now we've tried to hush it up. It makes the whole thing 1,000 times worse." Harold Waring was down by the lake. He had been walking feverishly for over an hour, trying by sheer physical energy to still the clamor of despair that had attacked him. He came at last to the spot where he had first noticed the two grim women who held his life and Elsie's in their evil talons. He said aloud, "Curse them! Damn them for a pair of devilish blood-sucking harpies. A slight cough made him spin round. He found himself facing the luxuriantly mustached stranger who had just come out from the shade of the trees. Harold found it difficult to know what to say. This little man must have almost certainly overheard what he had just said. Harold, at a loss, said somewhat ridiculously, "Oh, good afternoon." In perfect English the other replied, "But for you, I fear, it is not a good afternoon?" Well, Harold was in difficulties again. The little man said, "You are, I think, in trouble, monsieur? Can I be of any assistance to you?" "Oh, no thanks, no thanks. Just blowing off steam, you know," the other said gently, "but I think, that I could help you. I am correct, am I not, in connecting your troubles with two ladies who were sitting on the terrace just now?" Harold stared at him. "Do you know anything about them?" He added, "Who are you, anyway?" As though confessing to royal birth, the little man said modestly, "I am Hercule Poirot." "Shall we walk a little way into the wood and you shall tell me your story? As I say, I think I can aid you." To this day, Harold is not quite certain what made him suddenly pour out the whole story to a man to whom he had only spoken a few minutes before. Perhaps it was overstrain. Anyway, it happened. He told Hercule Poirot the whole story. The latter listened in silence. Once or twice he nodded his head gravely. When Harold came to a stop, the other spoke dreamily. "The Stymphalian birds, with iron beaks, who feed on human flesh and who dwell by the Stymphalian lake. Yes, it accords very well." "I beg your pardon," said Harold, staring. Perhaps, he thought, this curious-looking little man was mad. Hercule Poirot smiled. "I reflect, that is all. I have my own way of looking at things, you understand. Now as to this business of yours. You are very unpleasantly placed." Harold said impatiently, "I don't need you to tell me that." Hercule Poirot went on, "It is a serious business, blackmail. These harpies will force you to pay, and pay, and pay again. And if you defy them, well, what happens?" Harold said bitterly, "The whole thing comes out. My career's ruined. And a wretched girl who's never done anyone any harm will be put through hell, and God knows what the end of it all will be." "Therefore," said Hercule Poirot, "something must be done." Harold said baldly, "What?" Hercule Poirot leaned back, half closing his eyes. He said, and again a doubt of his sanity crossed Harold's mind, "It is the moment for the castanets of bronze." Harold said, "Are you quite mad?" The other shook his head. He said, "Mais non. I strive only to follow the example of my great predecessor, Hercules. Have a few hours' patience, my friend. By tomorrow I may be able to deliver you from your persecutors." Harold Waring came down the following morning to find Hercule Poirot sitting alone on the terrace. In spite of himself, Harold had been impressed by Hercule Poirot's promises. He came up to him now and asked anxiously, "Well?" Hercule Poirot beamed upon him. "It is well." "What do you mean?" "Everything has settled itself satisfactorily, but what has happened?" Hercule Poirot replied dreamily, "I have employed the castanets of bronze." Or, in modern parlance, I have caused metal wires to hum. In short, I have employed the telegraph. Your Stymphalian birds, monsieur, have been removed to where they will be unable to exercise their ingenuity for some time to come. They were wanted by the police? They have been arrested? Precisely. Harold drew a deep breath. How marvelous! I never thought of that. He got up. I must find Mrs. Rice and Elsie and tell them. They know. Oh, good. Harold sat down again. Tell me just what dash, he broke off. Coming up the path from the lake were two figures with flapping cloaks and profiles like birds. He exclaimed, I thought you said they had been taken away. Hercule Poirot followed his glance. Oh, those ladies? They are very harmless, Polish ladies of good family, as the porter told you. Their appearance is, perhaps, not very pleasing, but that is all. But I don't understand. No, you do not understand. It is the other ladies who were wanted by the police, the resourceful Mrs. Rice and the lachrymose Mrs. Clayton. It is they who are well-known birds of prey. Those two, they make their living by blackmail, mon cher. Harold had a sensation of the world spinning round him. He said faintly, but the man who was killed? No one was killed. There was no man. But I saw him. Oh no. The tall, deep-voiced Mrs. Rice is a very successful male impersonator. It was she who played the part of the husband, without her gray wig and suitably made up for the part. He leaned forward and tapped the other on the knee. You must not go through life being too credulous, my friend. The police of a country are not so easily bribed. They are probably not to be bribed at all, certainly not when it is a question of murder. These women trade on the average Englishman's ignorance of foreign languages. Because she speaks French or German, it is always this Mrs. Rice who interviews the manager and takes charge of the affair. The police arrive and go to her room. Yes. But what actually passes? You do not know. Perhaps she says she has lost a brooch, something of that kind. Any excuse to arrange for the police to come so that you shall see them. For the rest, what actually happens? You wire for money, a lot of money, and you hand it over to Mrs. Rice, who is in charge of all the negotiations. And that is that. But they are greedy, these birds of prey. They have seen that you have taken an unreasonable aversion to these two unfortunate Polish ladies. The ladies in question come and hold a perfectly innocent conversation with Mrs. Rice, and she cannot resist repeating the game. She knows you cannot understand what is being said. So you will have to send for more money, which Mrs. Rice will pretend to distribute to a fresh set of people. Harold drew a deep breath. He said, and Elsie? Hercule Poirot averted his eyes. She played her part very well. She always does. A most accomplished little actress. Everything is very pure, very innocent. She appeals, not to sex, but to chivalry. Hercule Poirot added dreamily, that is always successful with Englishmen. Harold Waring drew a deep breath. He said crisply, I'm going to set to work and learn every European language there is. Nobody's going to make a fool of me a second time.